Chapter 1. Steve Jobs, the Chosen One. John Jandali and Joan Scheibel were the biological parents of Steve Jobs. However, Scheibel's father, Arthur Scheibel, was a devout Catholic that did not approve of his daughter's relationship with John Jandali, a Muslim. Put for adoption, little Steve wound up with Paul and Clara Jobs. Paul Jobs was an engine technician who worked on cars. It was he who introduced Steve to engineering designs. Confused about having two sets of parents, Steve Jobs sometimes felt abandoned, yet chosen and special. When Steve Jobs was young, his parents moved to Palo Alto, California, the famous Silicon Valley, when the technological boom was at its peak. Before Jobs got into elementary school, his mother taught him how to read. He was therefore bored for the first few years, occupying himself by getting into trouble for pranks. It was also evident at this stage that Jobs, by nature, was averse to authority. Paul Jobs always treated his son as special and made sure everyone did the same. Even though Jobs' parents were not fervent about their faith, they wanted him to have a religious upbringing, so they took him along to Lutheran church where they attend occasionally. But it all came to an end when he became 13. In July 1968, he came across a publication in Life magazine dedicated to starving children in Biafra. The boy took this magazine to his pastor and asked him whether God knew about this. The pastor answered in affirmation. That was the last time Steve Jobs had anything to do with church and worship. He, however, spent a couple of years practicing Zen Buddhism. This summary portrays Steve Jobs not as a technological deity, but a human being with his flaws, complexes, and discrepancies. Was he a visionary? Yes. Did people enjoy working for him? Barely. Read on this summary to learn how Apple came to be and why Steve Jobs had to quit it to return and make it even more profitable. Chapter 2. A weird tandem of two Steves. During his high school days, Steve Jobs became friends with Stephen Wozniak, a school legend and wizard in his class. Wozniak was 5 years older than Jobs and had a better understanding of electronics. Both emotionally and socially, Wozniak was a high school geek. Just like Jobs, Wozniak learned most of what he knew from his father, but they had different lessons. Paul Jobs was a high school dropout who ended up fixing cars for a living. Francis Wozniak, known as Jerry, was an excellent engineer who graduated from Caltech. I remember him telling me that engineering was the highest level of importance you could reach in the world. It takes society to a new level. Steve Wozniak. Woz, short for Wozniak, spent most of his time at home reading his father's electronic journals, and he became fascinated by stories about computers, such as the ENIAC. Woz was very good at Boolean algebra, marveled at how computers were simple rather than complex, and built a calculator in 8th grade. The invention won the top prize in a local contest organized by the Air Force, even though he competed with students up to the 12th grade. Even though Wozniak was 5 years older than Jobs, their minds were alike, the mixture of pranks and electronics. The boys met in a mutual friend's garage and began the project called the Blue Box. It was a device that could fool the system into allowing a user to make a long-distance call without incurring extra charges. At first, the Blue Box was used for pranks and fun, but Steve Jobs came up with the idea that more Blue Boxes could be built and sold for profit. Steve Jobs calculated the cost of the component parts, from the power supply to the casing and keypads, and it was $40. Jobs then decided they should sell the Blue Box for $150. The friends made about 100 gadgets and sold all of them. If it hadn't been for the Blue Boxes, there wouldn't have been an Apple. Steve Jobs. Chapter 3. Steve Wozniak devised Apple I, and Steve Jobs monetized it. In the late 1960s, various culture currents flowed together in Santa Clara Valley. This was the period of a technology revolution that started with the growth of military contractors, which later included video game designers, microchip makers, electronics firms, and computer companies. The fusion of processor and flower power, enlightenment, and technology was embodied by Steve Jobs. During his morning meditations, he dreamed of starting his own business, audited physics classes at Stanford, and worked the night shift at Atari, a video game manufacturer. Alan Baum, Wozniak's friend, spotted a flyer on the HP Bulletin and called Woz, who agreed to attend the event with him. That event turned out to be the most important of his life. There was a demonstration of the new Altair, but of more importance for Woz was seeing the specification sheet for a microprocessor. The best way to predict the future is to invent it, Steve Jobs. Wozniak thought about the microprocessor described as a chip with a central processing unit on it, and he had an idea. At that point, he was designing a terminal with a monitor and keyboard that could relay to a distant minicomputer. But with a microprocessor, he could place the capacity of the minicomputer into the terminal itself, so it could become a standalone computer. It was a vivid picture, a screen, a keyboard, and a computer all in one as an integrated package. That night, he sketched out on paper what was later referred to as the Apple I. Woz attempted to use for Apple I the same processor found in the Altair, an Intel 8080, but they were unaffordable, so he searched for alternatives. When the best possible option is unavailable, look for the alternatives, not only as a means for replacement, but an indicator of the right direction. After months of testing, soldering to the motherboard, and handwriting codes, the computer was ready to be tested. It was Sunday, June 29, 1975, a milestone for the personal computer. According to Wozniak, never before had anyone typed a character on their keyboard to see it appear on the computer screen in front of them. Wozniak wanted to give the design for free, but Jobs found a way to monetize it, and that was how Apple was born. Chapter 4. Investment Roller Coaster for Apple II. On Labor Day, Woz worked on the prototype of the new machine that Jobs had hoped would take them to the next level, a machine to be named Apple II. The prototype was brought out only late at night for testing, to see how it projected on the color television in the conference rooms. As Woz typed on the keyboard, there were colorful lines and swirls burst on the screens across the room. The hotel's technician was the only outsider to see the Apple II, and he said he had checked all the other machines, but this was the only one he would be buying. Producing Apple II would require huge sums, so Wozniak and Jobs considered selling the rights to a richer company. Jobs went to Atari. He asked Al Alcorn, a chief engineer, for a chance to pitch it to Atari's management. A meeting was set with Joe Keenan, the company's president, who was a lot more conservative than Nolan Bushnell, founder of Atari, and Alcorn. Atari refused to buy the product. While pitching Apple II to potential buyers, Steve Jobs was barefoot and even placed his feet on the desk at some point. Eventually, Wozniak and Jobs got a line of credit of up to $250,000 from Mike Markula, the first Apple investor, in return for being a one-third equity participant. Apple got incorporated. Markula, along with Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, each owned 26% of the stock. The rest was reserved to be sold to future investors. The Apple II was marked in various models for the next 16 years and sold up to 6 million products, more than any other machine in the personal computer industry. Woz designed a great machine, but it would be sitting in hobby shops today were it not for Steve Jobs, Regis McKenna. Many people regarded the Apple II as Wozniak's creation. This spurred Jobs to pursue the next great machine, one he would call his own. Chapter 5. Steve Jobs, a man of paradoxes. Throughout his life that included spells of being broke and a billionaire, Jobs' attitude towards wealth was complex. Jobs was an anti-materialistic hippie, someone who capitalized on the innovation of a close friend who wanted to give them out for free. He was also a Zen devotee who went on a pilgrimage to India before deciding his calling was to create a business. These different characters seemed to weave together rather than conflict. Jobs had a great love for material objects, especially finely designed and crafted products like Mercedes and Porsche cars, BMW motorcycles and Ansel Adams prints, Henkel's knives and Braun appliances, Bang & Olufsen audio equipment, and Bosendorfer pianos. Yet the houses Steve Jobs lived in, no matter how rich he was, were simply furnished. There was no time that he kept a personal staff, not even for security. Jobs bought a nice car but always drove himself. Like his father, Steve Jobs was flinty when bargaining with suppliers. He never allowed the need to make profits to cloud his passion for building top-quality products. 30 years after Apple went public, Steve Jobs recalled that he never worried about money. He knew that he was a knowledgeable engineer who could allow himself to be voluntarily poor for a while. When he was incredibly rich, money for sure was not an issue. No matter how big his annual income was, Jobs opted for simplicity and minimalism, never letting material possessions ruin his life. Did you know? Steve Jobs became a majority stakeholder of Pixar in 1986, and Toy Story was the first computer-animated 3D film Pixar produced in 1995. Chapter 6. Dreaming the Mac Through Competition with IBM. In August 1981, IBM introduced its personal computer. Steve Jobs and the team at Apple bought one and dissected it. The general consensus was that it was still untested raw material. IBM used an old command line prompt, and the PCs did not support bitmapped graphical displays. In a Wall Street Journal advertorial, it was made clear that rebellious, daring, and young Apple was battling against heavy established and old Goliath. Throughout Steve Jobs' career, he saw himself as an enlightened rebel who was fighting against evil empires, something like a Buddhist samurai or Jedi warrior fighting the forces of darkness, and IBM was his perfect foil. Jobs always cast upcoming computer battles, not as a business competition, but a spiritual struggle. If for some reason we make some giant mistakes and IBM wins, my personal feeling is that we are going to enter a sort of computer dark ages for about 20 years. Steve Jobs. Jobs had a favorite maxim. It was a Kuhn-like phrase. The journey is the reward. He liked to emphasize his Mac team as a special group with a noble mission. He reflected that someday they would all look back on their journey together, laughing of the painful moments, which would be regarded as one of the magical moments in their lives. At the end of a presentation at a retreat in September 1982, someone asked if they needed to conduct market research to know what the customers wanted. Steve Jobs replied that customers will want whatever marketing shows them. Then he pulled out a mock-up device that resembled a PC. There was a screen, a keyboard, and it could fit on the lap. This, Steve Jobs said, was his dream that would change the future for all. Chapter 7. Dramatic Race to Take Over Apple. Jobs got the then CEO of Pepsi, John Sculley, to take over at Apple. But in 2 months, the honeymoon was over. By the second half of 1984, Macintosh sales began to wane because of several technical issues. This brought a rift between the pair. Jobs believed that Sculley never became a product person, while Sculley was fed up with Jobs' constant being obnoxious and rude toward other Apple employees. There were other reasons for the rift between Jobs and Sculley in 1985. Sculley found Jobs' behavior caddish, while Jobs found Sculley's lack of passion for the finer details of the products despicable. Sculley rose to the occasion, unlike Jobs. The board held conversations with both parties. Sculley was reminded that he was supposed to run the company, not be friends with Steve Jobs, whereas the latter was expected to brush things up at the Macintosh division. For the good of your life work, you might sometimes need to step aside and let someone else do it. Sculley decided to reorganize Apple in May 1985. One evening, he and Jay Elliott, human resources manager, came up to Steve Jobs, complimented him on his engineering brilliance, but also rendered less encouraging news. Sculley was going to propose a plan to the board that later had Steve Jobs removed from the Macintosh group. Steve Jobs was supposed to become the head of new product development. This plan would render Jobs powerless within Apple. Having heard of the plan, Jobs attempted to get rid of Sculley and take over Apple. However, this plan got leaked. Jobs offered to leave Apple and tendered his resignation letter, which was rejected by the board. Sculley also informed Jobs he had all the votes needed to reorganize Apple. A few months later, Jobs submitted his letter of resignation to the Apple board. He and 5 senior employees resigned and started a new venture, Next. Chapter 8. Steve Jobs didn't know what people wanted. He told them what they wanted. In 1996, Apple Computer Co. announced it was buying Next for $427 million. This deal brought Steve Jobs back to the company he co-founded. To return Apple to profitability, Jobs terminated some projects such as CyberDog and Newton in March 1998. Months after this, many employees were scared of encountering Jobs while riding in the elevator. Many were afraid they might not be in a job when the elevator doors opened. But in reality, Jobs rarely gave his employees the brush. But a few victims were a good enough number to terrorize the whole company. iMac. The iMac was the first great design to come from the Jobs-Ive collaboration. It was a desktop computer targeted at the home consumer market. Steve Jobs had specifications for the product, an all-in-one computer having a keyboard and monitor, ready to use right out of the box. The computer should come with a distinctive design, a brand statement, and would be sold for $1,200 or so. There was no Apple computer selling for less than $2,000 at the time. Jobs pursued his dream of the original all-in-one 1984 Macintosh. This striving presupposed that designers and engineers were to work together on the product. A good CEO thinks strategically about the future, values their employees, and always keeps in mind that they are the face of the company. There were design changes. It was the first computer to ship without a floppy disk drive. Steve Jobs explained why by quoting Wayne Gretzky's maxim, a hockey star, "Skate where the puck's going, not where it's been." The laptop had a plastic casing, sea green in color, as proposed by Ive and Coster. The casing was transparent, so you could see the insides of the machine. The plastic casing was simply built, yet complex. Each case cost more than $60 per unit. That's 3 times the price of a regular personal computer case. On the day he unveiled the Macintosh, a reporter from Popular Science asked Jobs what type of market research he had done. Jobs responded by scoffing. Did Alexander Graham Bell do any market research before he invented the telephone? Walter Isaacson. Other tech companies could demand studies and presentations to prove the translucent cases would increase sales to justify the extra cost. Steve Jobs did not ask for such an analysis. Conclusion. Life at Apple was tough because underperformance was not tolerated, even in the least. You either burned out, got fired for underperforming, or performed at the expected level. Jobs was notorious for firing people on the spot as soon as he got the impression that they were not an A player. Working 90-hour weeks was not uncommon at Apple. You were also occasionally called especially offensive names. Rough temperament was often the cause of workplace conflicts, and it also tended to restrain Jobs in keeping his head cool regarding business decisions. The conflicts between him and John Sculley was one of the reasons Jobs was fired from Apple. However, unlike Sculley, he believed that tech solutions could change the world, and gradually they did. Jobs had incredible intensity and made Apple the most valuable technology company in the world. The visionary said that he was very happy with his life and career. He believed that he had achieved all that he wanted to do. His zest and dedication were somewhat the result of his early childhood experiences, having 2 sets of parents, the ones that put him up for an adoption and the ones who chose him to be their son. Made him feel both abandoned and special at the same time. This duality marked his behavior throughout his personal and professional life, which proved to be inseparable. Jobs' strategy of integrated, tightly bound systems prevailed and stood the test of time. This strategy allowed for a superior, seamless user experience. Apple surpassed Microsoft as the most valuable company in the world right before Steve Jobs' death. Try this. To start your own engineering company, you do not need to have a visionary idea. You can choose to devise something each of us could use on a daily basis and still be popular on the market. There are a few tips on what to begin with if you want to become an entrepreneur. Find your niche. Be willing to take risks and make sacrifices. Make sure you have the right team. Both their hard and soft skills matter. Develop a viable backup plan for emergencies and crises. Pay yourself last. Listen to your employees' suggestions as to where your business is headed.